This is the premiere of Season 5, Kansas City's Darkest Crime, Heartland Homicide. And I've been waiting a long time for this one. I've covered Reno, I've covered Kentucky, and I've dug into places I've lived, like Leavenworth, Kansas. But Kansas City is a bit different. I lived there longer than I lived anywhere else, and that place shaped me. KC still feels like home, and its history runs deeper and darker than most people realize. And yes, the darkness is not unique. America is full of hidden violence, forgotten murders, and buried truths. We'll get to those places, of course. But this season belongs to Kansas City. This is KC's turn. And there's a lot of stories to uncover in what the newspapers once called the murder factory. But let's be honest, there's only one place to start. Jesse James, the outlaw, the legend, the myth, in the man who died in one of the most documented betrayals in American history. No filters, no mythology, no romanticizing, just the truth and the blood underneath it. And speaking of romanticizing, let me say this. I have met so many people from this region who swear they are related to Jesse James. I'm not kidding. I heard it growing up. I've heard it as an adult. And yes, even on my dad's side of the family, apparently we've got someone claiming distant outlaw blood. Everybody wants a piece of that mythology. Everybody wants to say they came from the James line. But that's the problem. The legend swallowed that man whole. Before we jump in, I want to say something from the heart. Thank you, every single one of you who listens, follows, shares, and supports this show. You matter more than you know. Now let's talk about the day Jesse James let his guard down and paid for it with a bullet to the back of the head. Before we get to the gunshot that ended his life, we need to strip the paint off the legend and talk about who Jesse James actually was. Jesse Woodson James was born in Clay County, Missouri in 1847, a border state kid raised in a world that was already tearing itself apart. Missouri wasn't just Southern learning. It was a breeding ground for guerrilla warfare, political rage, and vicious neighbor-against-neighbor violence. That was the environment Jesse grew up in, and it shaped him. By his teens, Jesse was not some misunderstood farm boy. He was riding with Confederate guerrillas, bushwhackers, men who specialized in ambush, burning, and killing. These weren't noble soldiers. They were irregulars, outlaws, and Jesse learned from the best or the worst, depending on how honest you want to be about it. After the Civil War, a lot of men went home. Jesse did not. He kept going. He and his brother Frank slid right into robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and surrounding states. They were not Robin Hood. They weren't stealing for the people. They were stealing because it paid and because the government was too weak to stop them in those early years. What made Jesse different was not the crime. Plenty of men robbed banks back then. What made him different was his skill with public attention. Jesse figured out early that if you controlled the story, you controlled your safety. Newspapers loved him, especially the Democratic-leaning papers that hated Republicans and union officials. They printed excuses for him, praised him, turned him into a folk hero, and Jesse ate that up. He wrote letters to the papers defending himself. He turned robberies into political statements. He stepped into the spotlight and made sure people saw him the way he wanted to be seen. Brave, wronged, misunderstood, a fighter for the common man. But in reality, Jesse James was violent, he was paranoid, and increasingly unstable. He trusted almost no one. He changed homes and aliases constantly. He kept weapons close, slept lightly, and feared betrayal from every direction. And he was right to. His gang was falling apart. Members were jailed, killed, or ready to turn him in. The law was closing in. The rewards on his head were rising. And underneath all the myth, here's the truth. Jesse wasn't living like a legend, he was living like a hunted animal. By the time he reached St. Joseph, Missouri in 1882, he was exhausted, desperate, and isolated. The man people still claim as a great-grandfather or misunderstood hero was barely holding his life together. And he had no idea that the two men he invited into his home, the Ford brothers, weren't loyal outlaws. They were scared, broke, and ready to sell him to the state for cash and a pardon. Let me be clear about something because this is where people get uncomfortable. Jesse James was not a hero. He wasn't a freedom fighter. He was not some renegade standing up for the poor. He was a violent outlaw trapped inside the mythology he helped write. People forget this because the legend is so loud. Movies made him noble. Newspapers made him a political martyr. Families claimed him out of pride. But the truth is a lot uglier. Jesse did not rob banks because he cared about ordinary folks. He robbed banks because that's what he knew. Violence, intimidation, and taking what he wanted. He didn't stay in the shadows because he was misunderstood. He stayed in the shadows because he had killed people, and the law wanted him dead or in chains. And this is what I mean by being trapped in his own legend. Jesse loved that attention. He loved the papers, and they defended him. He loved being seen as larger than life, but that spotlight painted him as a target. When you spend years building a myth, you eventually have to live up to it. You have to pretend you are invincible. You have to pretend you are in control. You have to pretend you're still the outlaw everyone thinks you are, long after the lifestyle has stopped being sustainable. By the end, Jesse was exhausted. He was broke and constantly running. Every friend looked like a potential traitor. Every stranger looked like a bounty hunter. That's not the life of a hero or a fighter for justice. That's the life of a man who set the story in motion and then realized the story owned him. So when I say he was not a hero or a freedom fighter, I don't say it to be harsh. I say it because the truth matters. The man behind the legend was human. He was also violent, brilliant, reckless, and trapped. And that trap is what killed him just as much as the bullet the Ford brothers fired. And if you're going to strip Jesse James of the mythology, you need to ground this in hard facts. The kind that don't care how people feel about him. And here are the realities that prove exactly who he was. Jesse joined the Confederate guerrillas as a teenager, not the army, the guerrillas. This means ambush attacks, civilian killings, mutilations, burning homes, raids meant to terrorize communities. He rode with men like Bloody Bill Anderson, whose group massacred unarmed Union soldiers and civilians in 1864. Eyewitness accounts describe scalpings, dismembering, and execution-style killings. Jesse was not forced into this. He volunteered. The James Younger gang killed civilians during their robberies. Romantic stories say they never hurt the innocent. The actual record says otherwise. Examples of this are the Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery in 1876. Civilians were gunned down in the street. 2 were killed. Jesse was part of a gang that left towns full of dead bodies and grieving families. Jesse was not stealing for a cause. He was stealing for cash. There is zero evidence he gave money to the poor. There is zero evidence any robbery was political after the war. He robbed the banks, the trains, the stagecoaches, and payroll shipments. He took whatever he could get his hands on. He lived off of stolen money, and he spent it as fast as he stole it. The freedom fighter angle was a newspaper invention. Jesse crafted his own myth through the press. Jesse wrote letters to newspapers defending himself, not just any papers, politically aligned papers that hated Union Reconstruction. He framed himself as a victim, a wronged Southern patriot, a man fighting against tyranny. And the newspapers printed it because it sold. This was early propaganda. Jesse was manipulating public opinion long before Hollywood got involved. When men got scared or wanted out or disagreed with Jesse, they often turned up dead, missing, or mysteriously ambushed. Members of his own gang described Jesse as paranoid, controlling, unpredictable, quick to violence. And that's not the behavior of a folk hero. That's the behavior of a violent criminal trying to keep his empire intact. By the end, Jesse was living under fake names because he was wanted for murder. He wasn't living like a rebel icon. He was living like a fugitive. He was moving constantly, using the aliases, renting houses under false names, terrified of betrayal, sleeping with guns under his pillow. Even the Ford brothers, who were criminals themselves, thought that turning him in was a safer bet. So think about that. Reward payout and begging the governor for a pardon were better options than staying loyal to him. Tells you everything. So the bottom line, every major historical record, newspapers, court documents, eyewitness statements, gang testimony, and Jesse's own letters all point to the same truth. Jesse James was not a hero trapped in a bad world. He was a violent outlaw who thrived on attention and paid for his own legend with his life. By the time we get to early 1882, Jesse James is not the powerful outlaws that newspapers made him out to be. He's not leading a massive gang, he's not living large, and he's definitely not untouchable. He's a man whose world is shrinking fast. Let's break down how he ended up in a little house in St. Joseph, Missouri, and why everything around him was collapsing. His gang was gone completely. By 1882, the James Younger gang was finished. Several members were dead, others were in prison, a few had quietly disappeared, and others, like the Ford brothers, were under pressure from the law. Jesse was running out of manpower, running out of friends, running out of people he could trust. A man who once commanded whole groups of robbers was now with two nervous brothers who barely respected him. The state of Missouri had finally had enough. For years, Missouri was divided about Jesse. Some citizens hated him, others romanticized him. But by the early 1800s, reward money was increasing. Governors were clamping down. Railroad companies wanted him gone. And lawmen were done playing games. He was not a symbol anymore. He was a liability. The pressure on his associates skyrocketed, especially on the Ford brothers, who were young, impulsive, broke, and they wanted a deal. Jesse didn't know it yet, but the political winds had turned. He was no longer protected by the myth he created. This was the part people never talk about. The great Jesse James was not living in some outlaw mansion. He was living like a desperate fugitive. He moved from town to town under the fake names like Mr. Howard, Thomas Howard, John Davis Howard. He lied about who he was. He lied about what he did. He lied about where he was from. His wife and children traveled with him. They did live in fear, of course, never staying long enough to build life. Jesse trusted no one, and for good reason. Trails surrounded him everywhere. The white two-story house at 1318 Lafayette Street wasn't a final stop in St. Joseph. It was just a safe house. It was a cheap rental Jesse took under an alias. He was exhausted from running, afraid of capture, and trying to rebuild a new gang from scraps. He brought the Ford brothers there because he saw potential muscle in them, not knowing they had already started negotiating with the governor for a pardon and $10,000 in reward money behind his back. Jesse thought he was regrouping. In reality, he was inviting his own executioners into his home. So at this point, Jesse is losing control, mentally, financially, and emotionally. He's living under the aliases, he's sleeping with weapons, he's watching the windows, moving constantly, trusting people he should not, becoming reckless. This was not a strategic outlaw at this point. This was a man unraveling under the weight of his own life. His legend made him famous, but his desperation made him sloppy. All of that led him straight to the rented house in St. Joseph, the one where he finally let his guard down. And that's where everything ends. On April 3rd, 1882, a morning in St. Joseph, Missouri, quiet, ordinary, nothing remarkable about it, except for the fact that one of the most wanted men in America was eating breakfast in a rented house under a fake name, Thomas Howard. Jesse James woke up that morning like he had so many mornings before, on edge. He was 34, but he looked older. The constant running had worn him down physically, mentally, spiritually. He had bags under his eyes, he had lost weight, he barely slept, and the paranoia that used to keep him alive was starting to choke him. But that morning, he let himself relax. He was in the house with his wife, their children, and the two men that he thought he could trust, Robert and Charles Ford. He had brought the Ford brothers into his home to rebuild his gang. He saw them as young, willing, and loyal. He didn't know that they were also broke, scared, impulsive, and, as I mentioned, secretly negotiating with the governor. After breakfast, Jesse noticed something outside the window. A newspaper article claiming the James gang had robbed a train, a robbery Jesse never committed. Rumors about him were everywhere, and they drove him crazy. He made a point of clipping stories that mentioned him. It kept him informed. It kept him sharp. So he did something he normally would not do. He walked across the room, stood up on a chair, and reached to dust off a picture frame hanging on the wall. It sounds harmless, meaningless, ridiculous even, but that small moment mattered because Jesse James almost never took his guns off, ever. That morning he had. He had placed them on the bed behind him because he didn't want the neighbors noticing an armed man climbing around the window. For the first time in years, Jesse was completely unarmed, back turned, distracted, focused on the picture frame instead of the two men behind him. Charles Ford hesitated. Robert did not. Both brothers knew this was the only moment they'd ever get. Jesse rarely let his guard down and almost never let himself be exposed. Robert Ford looked at his brother. He looked at Jesse, and then he made the decision. He drew his pistol, a Smith & Wesson .44, leveled it, and pointed it directly at the back of Jesse James' head. He did not speak. He did not warn him. He didn't give him a chance. He just pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered Jesse's skull, passed through his brain, and lodged in the opposite wall. Jesse collapsed, face first, to the floor. He died immediately. His wife screamed, the children cried, and the two men Jesse trusted stood over his body, shaking, not with guilt, but with adrenaline. They had just killed the most famous outlaw in America. And remember, they did it for reward money, the promise of a pardon, and the chance to be the men who finally brought down Jesse James. They didn't bring him down in a gunfight. They didn't outsmart him in a showdown. They didn't earn a heroic victory. They waited until he was not armed, until his back was turned, until he was doing something completely mundane like dusting a picture frame. That's how the legend of Jesse James ended, with one of the most unheroic deaths imaginable. The moment Jesse James hit the floor, the house erupted into chaos. And for the Ford brothers, these two men who thought they had just become heroes suddenly realized they had no idea what to do next. They weren't seasoned bounty hunters. They were not lawmen. They were two young, broke, nervous kids who had just killed a man in his own home. So they panicked. Instead of going to the sheriff's office quietly, Robert and Charles ran through the streets of St. Joseph yelling, "We killed Jesse James." They wanted the attention, they wanted the credit, they wanted the money. They thought people would cheer for them, but the reaction was not what they had expected. Word spread fast. In minutes, crowds gathered outside the house, and the vibe was hostile. To a lot of Missourians, especially former Confederates, Jesse was not an outlaw. He was a symbol, a rebellion, and a legend. And these two young men had shot him in the back while he was unarmed. This was not bravery. This was cowardice. People yelled at the Ford brothers. Some threatened them. Newspapers nationwide condemned the way Jesse died. Even people who hated his crimes believed the killing was dishonorable. The myth was stronger than the man, and the Fords had stepped straight into the blast radius. Here's the part a lot of people forget. Robert and Charles Ford were both charged with first-degree murder the very same day. They literally walked into the sheriff's office expecting a handshake and a reward, and instead got cuffs slapped on their wrists within hours. They were indicted, they were tried, and they were convicted, and they were sentenced to hang, all in a single afternoon. It was the fastest murder conviction in Missouri history. Then came the twist. The governor steps in. The whole thing was theater. Since the governor had already struck a deal with the Fords to kill Jesse, and he would give them a pardon and they would collect the reward money. So after that dramatic conviction, the governor pulled them out of jail and pardoned them just like that. Legally, politically, it was a mess. But it was also predictable. Jesse was a political problem. The governor wanted off the board. The state, the railroads, the private donors had all hinted at reward payouts, but when the dust settled, most of this disappeared. The Ford brothers got a tiny fraction of what they had been promised. Their big payday turned into a humiliating joke. Instead of fame, the Fords became hated men. Robert Ford spent the rest of his life being called a coward, a traitor, axe shooter, and a snake. Crowds booed him. Balloon patrons threatened him. Nobody wanted to drink with him, and nobody trusted him. He tried to turn the murder into theater, literally. He reenacted the killing on stage again and again until audience started throwing things at him. Charles Ford spiraled into depression and illness. Robert Ford was eventually shot to death in a saloon in 1892, killed by a man who claimed he wanted to avenge Jesse James. The assassination that was supposed to make them rich and famous ruined both of their lives. Meanwhile, Jesse James became bigger in death than he ever was in life. Within hours, people were cutting chunks of carpet from the murder scene. Within days, the house became a tourist attraction. Within weeks, dime novels rewrote Jesse's entire life into fantasy. He was no longer a paranoid outlaw living under aliases. He was resurrected as a folk hero, legend, martyr, the American Robin Hood. The truth, of course, is so much more complicated. The myth is simple. People always choose the myth. And in death, Jesse James became untouchable. The strange thing about Jesse James is not how he lived or even how he died. It's what happened after the bullet hit him. The outlaw was gone, but the myth that Jesse James people wanted to believe in became immortal. So let's break down exactly why America still clings to Jesse James and why the legend survived even though the facts completely contradict it. The country is built on the idea of defiance, rebellion, standing up to authority. Jesse fit the template perfectly, even if the reality was a lot uglier. He robbed trains that looked like sticking it to the big corporation. He fought the Union Army that looked like resisting the government. He vanished into the night that looked like freedom. It didn't matter that none of this was heroic. It just fit the storyline Americans love. Print media in the 1800s was basically the TikTok of its day. It was sensational, fast, and desperate for attention. Outlaw stories filled those columns. And Jesse wasn't just the subject, he was a willing participant. He was the first outlaw to understand brand management. I would put Custer in this same category. However, he's not considered an outlaw. The myth wasn't accidental. It was crafted by Jesse and amplified by the press. After the Civil War, the border states were traumatized. Communities were divided, people were angry and confused. Jesse James became a psychological coping mechanism, a symbol of Southern resistance, even though his crimes had nothing to do with politics. The myth served the moment, the truth did not. You can't interrogate a dead man. You can't force him to confess. You can't challenge his motive. Death freezes a person in whatever image the public prefers. And for Jesse, dying young, being shot in the back by men he trusted, created the perfect tragic legend. Americans love a martyr. They love a fallen star. They love a he was flawed but misunderstood narrative. Jesse's death handed them all of it on a silver platter. Hollywood finished what the newspapers started with dime novels, stage plays, radio dramas, black and white westerns, then big budget Hollywood films. Every generation retold Jesse's story. Each time they made him cleaner, more handsome, more noble, more dramatic. The violent outlaw vanished. The movie hero replaced him. By the 1930s, Jesse James was not a criminal, he was a pop culture icon. And once Hollywood puts its fingerprints on you, the truth doesn't stand a chance. This is why half the Midwest swears they're related to Jesse. It's why families keep sharing the stories. It's why my great-great-grandfather rode with the James Gang gets passed down like a badge of honor. Truth isn't the point, identity is. Claiming a legendary outlaw is easier than grappling with what he actually was. It's human, it's messy, and it's the part of why the myth will never die. Truth about Jesse James is simple. He was violent, he was manipulative, he was paranoid, he was no hero, and he lived a life built on fear, theft, adrenaline, and blood. The myth is what people prefer. The reality is what people ignore. And when a man dies young, suddenly, shockingly, and with a full legend behind him, the myth wins every single time. Jesse James became immortal not because of who he was, but because of who people wanted him to be. When you strip away the fantasies, the campfire stories, the Hollywood glow, what we're left with is a man whose life was a perfect storm of violence, ego, and bad timing. Jesse James was not a rebel fighting for justice. His death was not a showdown. It was not a noble last stand. It was a moment of vulnerability in a rented house with two men he should have never trusted. And that's the part of the story people don't like to sit with. Because the truth is this, Jesse James died the same way countless violent men die, abruptly, messy, at the hands of someone who decided the reward was worth more than the loyalty. But what happened afterwards is what makes him worth talking about. The public rage, the newspapers glorifying him, the dime novels rewriting him, the Fords becoming villains, and Jesse becoming a martyr in the eyes of people who never watched him pull a trigger. That reaction, the way society takes a violent man and polishes him into something heroic, is exactly why I wanted to open Season 5 right here. Kansas City has always had this tension, the truth of its history and the way people retell it. A city where corruption, crime, power, money, and legend mix together until fact and fiction are hard to separate. A place where the violent become folklore and the folklore becomes tourism. This is the heart of the murder factory. Not just the crimes themselves, but the stories people build around them. And Jesse James is the blueprint. As we move deeper into Season 5, we're going to peel back the same pattern across Kansas City's darkest crimes. The real stories, the real blood, the real power structure behind the myths. Because this city has a lot more to say. You've been listening to Deadly Truths, and this is our Season 5 premiere, Kansas City's Darkest Crimes, Heartland Homicide. Jesse James leaves behind a legend people still cling to, but next we're stepping into something far more explosive. The moment Kansas City became a national crime headline, the Union Station Massacre of 1933. Machine guns in broad daylight, federal agents gunned down, and a city thrown into the center of America's war on organized crime. If you thought Jesse James was dramatic, you haven't seen anything yet. Before we wrap, thank you again for listening, following, and sharing the show. Every rating, every follow, every share, it all matters. If you haven't left a review yet, take a second and do it. It helps keep these stories alive and pushes the truth into places it needs to go. And remember, the past isn't done, the legends aren't settled, and the truth, it's still being forged inside the murder factory.